Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Is this the most important election in Moldova's history? That's what President Maia Sandu calls it, and for once, the campaign cliche might be justified. Because in Chisinau right now, early autumn is fighting late summer in the sky, and Europe is fighting Russia on every other surface. Moldova stands at a crossroads. Brussels on one side, Moscow on the other. On Sunday, Moldovans won't just pick parties, they'll choose which pressure they prefer. And the measure of the result won't be who claims victory that night, but whether the next election arrives on time, with the choices still open.
With Moldova's parliamentary elections right around the corner, the country finds itself on the precipice of change. The stakes are high as Moldovans will choose whether they want an EU future or to be part of the so-called Russian world. President Maia Sandu has been warning about the dire threat that Russia poses to Moldova. She believes that the Kremlin threatens her country's independence and that it is trying to sway the elections in Russia's favor through nefarious means.
Russia has unleashed its full arsenal of hybrid attacks against us. The battlefield is our elections.
Moldovan authorities are doing what they can to root out the executors of Russia's political will. So far, 74 people have been detained over alleged involvement in a Russian plot to create unrest ahead of the upcoming pivotal vote. Police have so far carried out a total of 250 raids ahead of the elections, showing just how far Moscow's shadow truly reaches. Many Western powers in Ukraine have warned about the dire consequences should Moldova become more aligned with Russia, consequences which will spread beyond its own borders and perhaps even into the heart of the European Union.
And now, let's zone in on the eastplaining portion of our show. Over the last several years, Russia has been heavily investigating in the development of various means and tools to influence foreign elections. One of these measures is its AI-driven disinformation machine, whose latest target is Moldova.
One way the importance of the upcoming elections in Moldova is evident is the attention that Russia has been giving the vote. There has been a surge of disinformation across the Moldovan web that has been fueled by AI-generated content. Fake news websites linked to Russia, along with AI bots and fake social media accounts, have been spreading anti-government narratives ahead of the elections. Simultaneously, engagement farms located in Africa have been paid to boost narratives and accounts aligned with the Kremlin. One of the main targets of this disinformation campaign has been the Moldovan President Maia Sandu herself. She has been smeared with fabricated scandals, conspiracy theories, and even attacks based on her gender. This campaign is also reportedly paired with alleged illicit funding by pro-Russian Moldovan oligarch Ilan Shaw. He has been living in exile, most likely in Moscow, and has been accused multiple times of funneling money into a whole network of paid online ads which promote Russian narratives. Shaw has so far denied any wrongdoing.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Now, if you want a microcosm of Moldova, it's right there. One set of flyers promising a ladder, another warning it leads nowhere. Beyond the flyers, however, is the bigger context. Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine redrew Moldova's map of risk. The border is only about 50 kilometers from the capital. More than 1.3 million refugees passed through since 2022, around 100,000 stayed. Russian drones have fallen on Moldovan soil. And then there's Transnistria. Roughly 1,500 Russian soldiers parked inside Moldova's internationally recognized borders like an armed do not touch sign. Now, anyone campaigning on neutrality isn't wrong that Moldova needs peace. They're just ignoring who's already in the house. Sandu's government wants EU membership by 2030. It's not a fantasy. Moldova is a candidate state, but it requires some stamina and main reforms. The EU has pledged around 1.9 billion euros by 2027 in loans and grants, a lifeline for a small stretched state. Elections are also won on TikTok and other social media. There's Moldovan parties flooding Russian-language social media, pushing the usual lines. NATO and Ukraine want to drag us into war. Your men will be sent to the front. The election is rigged anyways. And it's meant to sow doubt. If you can't win voters, try to unmoor them from reality. The Center for Independence Journalism is tracking the trend, and the goal is obvious. Make truth sound optional and sovereignty becomes negotiable. But propaganda only sticks when it finds a crack. And in Moldova, the crack is the cost of living. When Russia attacked Ukraine, Moldovan inflation shot to about 29%. It's down, but still around 7.3%. Pensioners have to queue outside supermarkets, and the very same markets where the elderly sell fruit to survive. At the same time, rent bites hard. Many pay 500 euros for a one-room flat, while average monthly income hovers near 800 euros. When you spend more time calculating groceries than geopolitics, Europe can sound abstract, and Russia can pose as stability. And that's the trap. So, is this really the most important election? It depends on what you think elections are for. If you think they're weather vanes, then sure, this is a gusty one. EU or Russia, West or the East. But the better question is, which choice gives Moldovans the ability to keep choosing? Just check who collects the toll. So yes, call this the most important election if by important you mean a vote about who gets to set the price of tomatoes in the terms of truth. About whether Moldova is a bridge that chooses its traffic or a road chosen by others. In a country squeezed by prices, propaganda, and a neighbor's soldiers, the most important election isn't East versus West, it's Moldova versus fear. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Ryhor Nisnikal, a senior researcher from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello.
So we're looking down a very pivotal election for Moldova. And well, ahead of the election, the President Maia Sandu has been sounding off on potential Russian interference. I'd like to play devil's advocate today and ask, well, with these very substantial claims, it must have some substantial evidence. What do we know so far about these potential Russian interference?
Well, I would say it's in between, before our eyes. So we do see that Russia has been interfering in not just the current electoral campaign, but in Moldovan politics and the electoral process for over the year. And we can just talk about the presidential election and referendum last year. But this time we do see the same evidence of vote buying, of using all type of basically vote rigging processes, including sending people to vote at the different diaspora polling stations abroad in Europe, and obviously corrupting the politicians and buying political forces to stand for Russian interest in this election. So there is a lot of evidence that is just in front of our eyes.
Right. And do you think this is substantial enough to tip the scales, as we do know that there are people in Moldova with Russian sympathies, even without having to be nudged in any sort of way? How substantial are these interference going to affect the coming election?
We would have to say that this might be really decisive, because the country is indeed polarized. We do see that the government is not popular enough. And that's why we actually do have to say that the government made a lot of mistakes to turn away neutral voters away from the pro-European party and basically hand them in Russian hands. But knowing that the election might be decided in the last moment, again, going back to the referendum about European integration and presidential election, where decision was so narrow, we can say that any vote counts, and Russians are really doing their best to make sure that this government will not win this election.
I'm curious about what the role of social media or even traditional media is going to play in this round of elections. And what's the trend? We saw back in Romania where social media actually played a very big role in swaying voters. Is that going to be the same kind of trend there in Moldova?
Yes, it will work the same way. And actually, coming to your first question, yes, I forgot to mention that the amount of money Russia invests in disinformation and all these networks on social media is staggering. And we have actually very nice investigations, media investigations into that. So we do see that the Russian presence on TikTok, on social media is huge, and they are spreading all type of I would say, lies and nonsense around this government and about basically Moldova. So this is a huge factor which not only showed its efficiency in Romania, but also, again, in Moldova before.
And why is it that social media is better at amplifying these more anti-government sentiment messages? Do you think it's resources being poured into it, the approach that's being used, or something just resonated a little bit better somehow?
I think it's obviously a combination of factors. So, in addition to what you've said, I think it's valid points. But first, we also have to add that it's to a certain degree a gray zone. So, if you go to Chisinau, you will see that there's very few billboards, very few information. Basically on the fences in the public eye, because this has to be verified and has some control over that. But in the social media, you can just, on Facebook or TikTok, just fume in this information, and with very little resources, achieve much greater result. I would say this is the core problem, that the social media allows this unverified and toxic information to flow freely.
And I'm also curious about the internal politics in Moldova, because, of course, from an international perspective, I think we're all looking at this as a Brussels versus Moscow perspective. But that's not really the people on the ballot, is it? There's different candidates, perhaps also different approach towards domestic policies. What's separating these candidates apart?
Well, it's exactly about domestic politics. And the problem is, and I think one of the problems for the EU is that the EU became a part of domestic politics, which actually taints the EU image in Moldova. The problem, obviously, which Moldovans worry most about are social economic. So the inflation, the cost of living, something that has been on Moldovans' minds for a very long time. Obviously, they don't see the progress under this government. They actually think the government did not fulfill its promises. And that's why for them, for many of them, especially for the neutral voters, which are a significant part and which will decide this fate of these elections, they think that they've been let down, and they don't want to talk about Russia. They don't want to talk about the war. They don't want to talk about some geopolitical conflicts. They actually want problems to be solved inside their country, and they are upset with the track record of this government.
Right. Speaking of EU, we do know that a very, well, not unsubstantial amount of Moldovan voters also hold Romanian passport. Do you think that the possibility of already having access to the European Union might somehow weaken their drive and resolve to go to the polls to vote specifically for this EU integration as an issue?
Actually, I don't think so, although it's actually a case for a very good study. We actually see that diaspora, so people with Romanian passports or who live, with Romanian passports in Moldova, but who live abroad, they actually have been very important and have been, it was quite a good force in previous elections. And they are quite, I wouldn't say easy, but they can be mobilized.
Right.
And they really mobilized last year, and they mobilized actually to elect Sandu in 2019 and helped Sandu to win and her party win elections in 2020. So they are a very potent force, which don't forget about their roots. But the question to them is that, of course, and to many people in Moldova, is that if they don't see much of a difference between this government and let's say the opposition on, they feel that they've been betrayed, and it doesn't matter that much who runs the country because there is no difference. That demobilizes, right? So this is the problem, that the government cannot really rally too many people around them beyond their core base because they've been too disappointing.
Right. You also spoke about the polarization of the country politically, and ahead of the election, we're already seeing both parties kind of pointing fingers at each side, saying that, well, they won't go quietly if they lose the election. They expect protests, street riots. What do you think the odds of that happening? And do you think that either side have a valid point in, well, essentially accusing the other side of being sore losers before the election even took place?
I think this is the usual. This is the basically an element of Moldovan politics for the last 15 years. So since basically 15 years. So since the communist rule fell, we do see the cycles of instability and actually protests and threats of protests for a very long time. I do see this as a little bit exaggerated at the moment, but I would say there is a high chance that Russians will use that and will continue destabilizing the country if they don't get the result they wish and they hope for and they expect. So if this government stays in power, if PAS wins the election, not win the election, but is able to form the government after this election, I will see that Moscow will turn to more coercive and more assertive means to impose its will on Moldova. So that for the next year, I would expect much more instability if this government stays in power.
Right. And last but not least, coming back to the EU integration, can you help us paint a picture of just how pivotal this election is going to be? And do you think that to differentiate this being the decision point of Moldova being either with EU or with Russia is a more kind of polarizing language, or is that actually the reality that we're looking at?
I think to a certain degree it is a reality. Moldova, this government has probably achieved more than all of its predecessors combined. The EU has invested massive resources in the Moldova's integration course and integration path, and we've seen successes, and the screening process, which just ended a couple of days ago, is a sign of that. And I think this huge impact on Moldovans themselves. There is still issues. So even if this government claims that they will finish the accession negotiations under the next government term if they win elections, so basically up till 2029, there are still a lot of ifs if the EU actually will be able to do its part of a deal. And we haven't spoken about Transnistria, but the Transnistrian question really looms at the background of this, whether actually the EU will be ready to accept Moldova without Transnistrian issue being resolved is a huge question mark, and I think this question hasn't been answered.
Right, so there is a lot of bumpy road ahead either way it goes. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you so much.
Cheers. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Ukrainian President Zelensky says that he won't seek re-election after the war. He has also announced he intends to push for elections during a potential ceasefire.
Ukraine's constitution currently forbids carrying out elections under martial law, which was imposed on the country at the start of the Russian invasion. For elections to be held, the Ukrainian parliament must first lift martial law and then set a date for the vote. One of the Kremlin's favorite propaganda narratives has been to accuse Zelensky of being an illegitimate leader to discredit the Ukrainian government, because his first term in office was originally supposed to end in May 2024. The Ukrainian president is striking back against this narrative, however, and has declared that his goal is to finish the ongoing war and bring his country through the current hardships. Zelensky has also not ruled out the possibility of holding elections during a ceasefire if one is achieved, and outright said that he would push for a vote in that period.
Ukrainian strikes on Russian fuel infrastructure are beginning to bite, as Russia has extended its fuel export ban till 2026. Gasoline shortages have been reported all across the Russian Federation.
The prices of fuel have surged all over Russia in recent months. The reason for this have been Ukrainian drone attacks, which have managed to damage several oil refineries and even shut down major facilities. The fuel shortages have been reported across the whole country, though some regions and cities, like Moscow itself, have been far less affected than more rural areas. Illegally annexed Crimea has been one of the most affected areas, as reportedly half of its filling stations have run out of fuel. Russian authorities are currently scrambling to resolve the issue. One of the ways in which they have approached the matter is a ban on gasoline exports. This move is meant to help stabilize the situation in the domestic market.
Uzbekistan is hard at work to become a role player, not just in its own region, but in the big leagues. The country is reportedly on track to join the World Trade Organization as early as spring 2026.
Gaining a WTO membership is a very time-consuming process. For example, it took China, an economic powerhouse, 15 years for its application to be approved. Although Uzbekistan's accession process dates back to 1994, the country first demonstrated serious intent to meet the organization's requirements in 2024. The WTO director manager now says that Uzbekistan could win its acceptance bid in a matter of months. The country's government has been heavily investing in trade over the last couple of years, including a plan to purchase $105 billion worth of US goods to help fuel Uzbekistan's ongoing economic transformation.
And that's all for this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.